Welcome to this first this one of 3 sessions that are happening in this slot after lunch. Thank you all for joining. So it's a session on planting on ponds and water habitats. We're delighted we've got Sheila Gundry with us today. Sheila lives in Bath and she runs FrogLife's pond creation and community engagement programs. She's a trustee for Bristol and West England Community Energy Fund, a fellow of the National Association for Environment Education, and also a key member of Bath Orchard Share, and loves our local parks, I'm told. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Sheila. As you see, she's got a presentation she's going to share, so it should be an interesting session. Do put any questions you have in the chat. Thank you. Over to you, Sheila.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Rob. And I'm also in a very good mood today. I had my COVID jab yesterday, so very pleased about that. And discussing ponds for much of the afternoon makes me very happy. So I'm looking forward to it. I hope you are too. Starting here with this pond, and I don't know about you, but I just sort of go, just sort of relax and just think, oh, it just makes me sort of feel happy and peaceful when I see a pond like that. And you can just sort of imagine yourself on that little bench, and even though it's in the winter there, you can still see there's quite a lot of features in that pond. You've got the little sort of insect home just beyond it. You've got various habitats all around, lots of dead wood, bits of plants in the pond, out of the pond, and you can just think there'll be a little robin popping around there, and there'll be in the summer there'll be some dragonflies, and there'll be birds popping in for a drink. So that's the sort of thing that'd be just lovely to have in our park. And you'd look at that and you'd think that must be some sort of wonderful rural idyll, but I'll show you where it actually is. There's a little map coming up of where that pond actually is, and it's called Archbishop's Park, and it's bang next to Waterloo Station, and so there's continuously trains coming up from the south there, just loads and loads of different trains coming up. And there's a massive hospital here, that's St Thomas's Hospital, just off to the west of the park. So it's about as urban and as difficult a location as you possibly could get. It also has vast numbers of people coming through. It's very, very heavily used, and there's great demand for space in that park because there's a lot of recreational use and dog walkers and all sorts of different demands on that park. So nevertheless, they've managed to put in a most beautiful, lovely pond. So I suppose that's one of our messages today is, well, if they could do it, we can do it in our lovely Bath and Bristol parks. So let's find ways of getting ponds in our parks. So today, I'm going to talk about why ponds are so important in the first place. So why should we bother with a pond in our park or our green spaces? Which species they're important for, and I have to tell you that amphibians are going to feature quite heavily. I am from FrogLife, but obviously they're very important for a good range of species, but amphibians are going to be in there. And then how you know what you've got in your pond, so in your park pond, how do you know? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the different species that you might find and how you know what special things you've got in your pond. Obviously, we need to think about, is a pond right for your park or green space? So in your particular park or your green space, is a pond the right thing to put in there? And if it is, well, where should the pond go? And how do we create and maintain a pond? So actually, if you decide you want a pond, how actually do you go about creating it? How do you maintain it? And what are some of the challenges of that? So here we go. Why ponds are important. Well, for wildlife, they're really, really vital. As a water source, just to drink. So you'll see birds coming in and hedgehogs going in. And so just having somewhere to drink. And if you think in your park or your green space, have you actually got somewhere that different species can come and drink just as a water source? Is there somewhere? It helps a lot of different animals. So there's frogs and toads and newts all actually need it to breed. They need the ponds to breed. But there's all sorts of species that just live there all the time. So there's freshwater invertebrates that just live in the pond the whole time. And so they're very important for themselves, but also important as a fundamental part of the food chain for other things to eat and other species as a source of food. So really, really important for life cycles. and really important for wildlife of all different sorts. It's surprising how many different sorts of wildlife you'll see, from blackbirds having a wash to things breeding there, things eating there, things drinking there. So it's really important for lots of different wildlife. We've had a massive decline in ponds across the country. There used to be loads all over the place. There's been a massive decline. So it's quite important to reverse that and get back to where we were. We've got the ecological emergency to think about, but of course there's the carbon issues as well. So we've got a climate change emergency, and ponds are surprisingly important for that too, because the actual water can absorb some carbon, but also there are a lot of species that live in the pond that are photosynthesizing, and they're taking in carbon dioxide too. So little tiddly species that are swimming around in the water, but also the plants that are at the bottom of the water, they're photosynthesizing and taking in carbon, producing oxygen. So ponds are very important as a carbon sink. So we're putting a lot of effort into putting trees, and because they're great for reducing carbon, but also ponds are really important too. And then I suppose back to when at my first slide, when I was saying just how good it is for our well-being, just having that water, having that a bit of peace and calm, it is remarkably good for our well-being. And I'm hoping Rob can add that little link to the chat box, which is showing that that's just a really good resource for showing how good they are. So it's the Wildlife Trusts did a really good document which shows the massive amount of evidence and data that there is that our green spaces and ponds are really important for our well-being. So for our mental health, as well as obviously the physical side of digging your pond is good on the physical health side. So a lot of reasons for the importance of our ponds. Now, I did say I would talk about amphibians particularly, and if you can see that graph on the left there, the extinctions one, amphibians are really struggling. They're struggling a lot, and just to interpret that graph, this is the time along the date along the bottom coming up to the present day, and then up the side is the number of extinctions that are occurring of different species. And as you can see, fishes are suffering and they're doing really badly, reptiles are doing really badly, birds are doing even worse, and we all hear of different bird species we're trying to reintroduce, or I don't know, cranes coming back in, and we've got various different things that corn crakes are struggling, and we're trying to do programs about them. So there's lots of different birds are declining, and we're doing things about them. Mammals too, we hear about rhinos or otters or whatever, but the worst of all of them is our poor old amphibians. So amphibians really are struggling, and they do like parks, so they're having a rough time. They do like parks, so that's part of my why not get ponds in park and help out our amphibians. As well as amphibians really declining, they get incredibly forgotten. They just get forgotten about. So this is our UK State of Nature report in 2019. And of just the number of mentions in the report, 44% of the mentions were birds, 40% were fish, and the actual mentions were 3% of them were amphibians. So they were just not included in the report of how our nature is doing. And that's not because the people who wrote it aren't interested in amphibians, it's just that we're really short on data and there just isn't very good information on amphibians. So they get forgotten about because we don't have a lot of great data on them. So it is important to know where amphibians are, how they're doing, and having good data so that we can see what the situation is, and we're less likely to forget all about them. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about our amphibians, just so as to make sure we all know what they look like, and if you've got a local pond, what sort have you got in them. So you'll probably recognise that one as a frog, and its features are it's got that very dark patch behind its eye, and that's quite handy for identifying because quite often you can just see the head of the frog and you can't see the rest. So that's got that dark patch there, whereas the toad, the one in the middle there, it doesn't have the dark patch behind its eye. Another big difference is, can you see its stripy legs with the frog on the left there? Very stripy legs, and whereas the toad doesn't have the stripy legs, and the frog also has much longer legs, really long legs, and it tends to hop, whereas the toad tends to sort of waddle along and sort of walk around. I really don't think you'll see this third one at all. That's a natterjack toad. That's not likely to be found in Bath and Bristol, but just so you know what it looks like, and it's got that distinctive stripe. So if you did see one, you'd know. But you're not. But the common frog and the common toad, you're really likely to find those, but not the natterjack toad. Then we've got our newts, the smooth newt, our palmate newt, and the great crested newt. And that great crested newt over on the bottom right there, it's actually bigger than it looks. Actually, it's bigger than the other two. The picture, you don't see that. So the way you tell it's a great crested newt because it's so much bigger. It's also got that crest and the sort of little dip there, and that white streak on the tail is quite distinctive as well. So you are likely to find smooth newts in the park ponds. You're likely to find palmate newts. They prefer a little bit more acid, but you're very likely to find those in our parks in Bath and Bristol. And the pool frog you're not likely to find, but there actually is a recording of that in our area. There is a recording, but they actually died out, and it's a reintroduction. So it's possible, and we'd like to know if you find one, but it's possible that you might get one of those. But the main things you're likely to see: the smooth newt, the palmate newt, and the great crested newt, as you probably know, is protected. So just a quick look at the how to identify it. The smooth skin, whereas the toad is bumpy. The dark patch behind the eye and the long striped legs, they're really good ways of spotting it. And the thing with frogs is they're just so different. So they have really variable coloration, just really, really different coloration. So they're all frogs, they're all common frogs, but they look really, really different in their colours. So that's just, you might look at it and think, what on earth is this I've got in my pond? And actually, it's got its dark patch there, it's got its stripy legs, and so actually it is a frog. With the red ones, there's actually a nasty disease called ranavirus that does cause red markings, and that is different. You'll know if it's ill because it'll have like red ulcers and it'll look really ill. So if it's just a red frog, it's a red frog and nothing to worry about. But so just mix it up with the illness, ranavirus. And just while I'm thinking of it, if you do see any ill or dead wildlife, there's a good website called the Garden Wildlife Health website, and which again I hope will pop up in the chat box, and that is a good way of reporting any illnesses, and it tells you about the different illnesses there might be, because amphibians do struggle a lot with different illnesses. Okay, common toad, as we said, rough warty skin there, shorter hind legs, and without the dark patch. So you can see if you've got a toad. And we have a lot of toads, right? This is the toad patrols in Bath and Bristol. So there's the fish ponds one over here. You can see Two Valley Lake, and there's a patrol there, and there's quite a few over sort of Portishead and Cleveland Way, and the Chalcombe Lane one in Bath. And toads tend to go back to their same pond every year, and so if we stick a road in the way, they just get crushed on the road, and it's just appalling. The actual numbers that die is just really shocking. And so there's groups of volunteers that help them across the road in all these different places, and there's a link there if you want to see where your nearest toad crossing is. If you just put your postcode in, it'll tell you where your crossing is, and it's happening now. I was out on Thursday night, and we found half a dozen toads and frogs all heading across at this one in Bath. So there's quite a few in our area. But I'm mentioning it now because if you've got a park nearby, it's really important that your park has got suitable habitat for toads. So if you're near a toad patrol and there's a toads in that area, it's really important that you're creating some suitable habitat for toads so they've got somewhere to live, because they only pop down to the pond just this time of year to breed, and then most of the year they're out and about and they move around, say 3 kilometers, and so anywhere nearby is really good if you can just make sure that they've got some, a pile of logs and some pile of stones and things for them to sort of hide under, some rough grass, just some nice habitat for toads. Okay, this is, again, we're just at the perfect time of year for seeing these things. It is just happening absolutely now. So we've got the spawn happening now. If you look in ponds now, you will see the frog spawn. So that's that one on the left, the frog spawn. Each individual produces a couple of thousand eggs, and so you can see them all piled up there. And then to see the toad spawn, you've got long strips, so you can see the sort of in pairs long strips, and they sort of wind them around the vegetation in the pond. So that's why it's important to have nice vegetation in the pond for them to wind their eggs. And then the tadpoles are a little bit similar, but they tend to be darker, the toad ones, and a little bit more speckly, the frog ones. So they sometimes start off dark, but they tend to be a little bit more speckly. But also the toads are more likely to go around in shoals, so go around in groups rather than just sort of randomly. You may see some non-natives, and if so, let us know, because certainly the African clawed toad, it brings disease in, and these ones compete for habitat. So if you've got any non-natives, do let us know if you find any of those. We've got the newt, the smooth newt, which is it's sort of yellow underneath with a few black spots, and the male is a bit more dominant than the female. I'm not going to go into this in any particular detail, just to let you know there's the two different types. And one of the main ways to spot is, well, don't pick it up, get a little pot and have a look underneath it. But this one, the palmate newt, it doesn't have the spots on its chin. Oh, and the other thing to do just now is, if at night, if you go to your pond and shine a torch in, the newts are in there, and you'll be able to see what sorts they are, and that's a really good way of seeing newts just at this time of year. And you can see the foot there, it's quite sort of webbed, and so that's a really good thing to see just now. And also when you've got a little spike on its tail, so that's the other way of telling palmate newt. But it's a great thing to do. Obviously, think about safety at the moment. If it's night and you're going out to ponds, obviously consider your safety. But if you can, and you've got an opportunity of going to a safe pond, it's a really good thing to do. Just take your torch and see what you can find. You never know what you'll find with the newts. Great crested newt, much bigger, protected, and really dark, especially when it's out. It's quite black. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I will just talk a little bit about the eggs, because they at the moment, when they're laying eggs, when the newts are laying eggs, they just like to find a piece of grass and hide it in the grass, just sort of fold it over, and they spend ages on it and do it really, really carefully. You've got the great crested newt on the right-hand side, and then the other two newts on the left-hand side. So again, it's important in your ponds to have some suitable grass that they can do this with. And this is now, there's your little test. Can you spot the eggs? So it's got a bit of vegetation there. Can you spot the eggs? Just have a quick look. There's one. And there's the other. Pretty well hidden, aren't they? You have to look really carefully, and just going in a bit closer, you can now see really clearly. So there's that one there. You can see it's just folded over, and there's an egg actually inside there, and then here you can just about see the egg, so you can see that's what the newts do with their eggs. So some vegetation like that, and then when the newts come along, they can then lay their eggs, and there they are. We've got some non-natives as well, not good news, and just as you know, that's what they look like, the non-natives. Now, I said it's really important that we record them, and one way you can do it is use the Dragon Finder app, and it is really straightforward. It is just on amphibians and reptiles, so it's really straightforward. You can just go in, and it says, has it got a smooth skin or a bumpy skin, and so you can just work out, is it a frog or a toad if you're not sure. And with the newts, it'll give you has it got a spotted chin business or not. So it's really easy to use and to upload the information. And as I say, we're really short on good data, and so if you can just whenever you find anything, upload it on the Dragon Finder app, and as I say, the natives or the non-natives, just let us know where they are. It'd be absolutely fantastic to get a bit more information about where amphibians and reptiles are in the UK. There are other ways of recording it, so there's other apps and there's other systems for recording it, but just make sure whatever it is does go to the National Biological Network, so that because we send all our data there, so we've got the national record of the species. So whatever system you use, make sure they are sending it on to the NBN. Right, on to the parks, and whether your park is right for having a pond and likely to get all those wonderful species, the amphibians, and all the many, many other species that might well come to the pond. So I hear you think my park looks like that, which is just, I actually took that yesterday. That's Kensington Meadows in Bath, and quite a lot of parks are rather like that, just a big area of green. And so where did your pond go? And what do we do? How do we actually get a pond when you've just got a big area like that? And also it's well used, but in other ways. So yesterday there was quite a lot of dog walkers, and then you can see the goalposts over there. There was someone using that as their fitness thing and doing lots of pull-ups there. So it is quite well used for other things. So where would it go? And deciding the best place for a pond in a park is quite important. So it doesn't go in the wrong place and cause issues. There are issues on health and safety, and some people are really very, very concerned on health and safety, and that's something that just stops ponds in many places. It's just because of the health and safety. But most parks that have tried it, they've fenced off the ponds, and it's worked fine. If you're very concerned, you can put a very big fence. The photo I showed at the beginning has just quite a casual fence, but it's it's something it's resolvable. You can position your pond next to somewhere that's not that accessible. If you're worried about children running in, you can certainly fence it off to make it as safe as possible. And if you're very, very, very worried, you could put a grid on. We'd rather you didn't, but it would if it's going to be a deal breaker and you can't put a pond in otherwise, you could put a grid on. But it does limit what animals can get in and out there if you put a grid on. So we'd rather you didn't. But if it's better than nothing, I suppose it's better if you can at least put a pond in of some sort. And I think talking to people before the pond goes in is really important, because if people are worried about safety and their children falling in the ponds, if you chat to them before and talk through why you're doing it and get their ideas, and then you can find ways of resolving that. And the pond design's really important too, because if you have a nice gentle slope rather than really steep sides, then if someone falls in, they can easily get out and it's not a dire situation. Whereas if you've got very, very sheer sides, it's an issue for wildlife as well as an issue for people if they fall in. Think about what's underneath the pond at the moment. Sometimes parks are on landfill sites or something, so you wouldn't really want to dig into them. Hedgemead Park in Bath is actually on an old landslip. There was an appalling landslip sort of like over 100 years ago, and lots of houses just slipped down the slope and they turned it into a park. So if you're going to dig there, obviously that sort of thing you need to know about, and you need to think carefully about where it would be and is it a good idea. So find out what's underneath at the moment, and obviously to make sure there's no cables or other issues that would cause a problem underneath the current wherever you want your pond to go. In terms of where in the park should it go, then think about the slope and the water flows. So I'm thinking of Inex Park in Bath, and it's very steep and it's really marshy at the bottom, so that might well be the very best place to put it. But on the other hand, there's Bath City Farm right next door, and that's got quite a nice pond just part way down the slope. So part way down the slope might work too. So just have a look at where the water flows are, and that's one factor. But it just makes it easy. If it's wet and the water's flowing into it, you don't have issues in the summer of it drying up. If you've got constant water flow coming in, just using the natural flows, it makes it simpler for the future. Think about trees. You don't want overhanging branches because lots of leaves fall in. So, and then you've got a clearance issue. So think about where the trees are and not having them too close. And sunlight is generally good because the different species like some sunlight, but not too much sunlight, because it just gets too hot and it dries out in the summer. And especially thinking climate change, I mean, if we get more and more hot summers, well, that's going to make it difficult for our ponds. And you don't want them to dry out before the species have had a chance to turn from the tadpoles into the adults. You don't want it to dry out too soon. So partial sunlight is good, but you don't want it completely hidden away and completely dark. So some sunlight is good. Okay, think about who's using the park and where the footpaths are at the moment. So you do want it where people can see it so they can enjoy it and make the most of it. But sadly, dogs are very, very bad news for ponds. Dogs are really bad news. They love jumping in them, and it just stirs up all the sediment, and then it's harder for the sunlight to get in, and the plants can't survive, and it doesn't do the invertebrates any good at all. So dogs really do damage ponds just by jumping in them. But also just recently I've been reading a couple of papers about the chemicals on dogs. So when you do the de-fleeing, the chemicals stay in the dogs, and that is actually getting into the water. And there's been some research recently which showed that the levels that are in the water as a result of dogs jumping in are enough to cause problems with the invertebrates in the ponds. So it's really not a good idea to have dogs getting in ponds. And actually, I've actually seen recently there's been some adverts for wild swimming for dogs. So there's people actually, dog walkers, commercial dog walkers, are actually advertising wild swimming for dogs and encouraging people to let their dogs go and jump in ponds. So that's really to be discouraged. And the way to discourage it is just to have ponds not where the dogs are, because if they see one, they'll jump in. So just to have the ponds somewhere where the main dog walking areas aren't. So that brings me to the next point is, do you need ponds for different purposes? So it could be that you want ponds that are sort of duck ponds, or just or ponds that have sort of ornamental ponds in some places, and then maybe you want your wildlife pond somewhere else. So it could be you have different ponds meeting different needs in your park. Right, so how big? Well, 2 meters by 2 meters is a standard. It should be, that's a decent size to have a wildlife pond, 2 meters by 2 meters. But if you haven't got space, or you don't want, if you can't manage that much, just any pond is better than nothing. So even if I know someone who just got a cat litter tray and put some stones and a few plants, and even that got wildlife coming in. So, and hedgehogs can come and drink, and just any water, just add some water. So if it's tiddly, it doesn't matter, but the bigger the better. That's what I'm saying. So just put some water in your park, but the bigger the better. And especially with toads, they really like the big and deep ponds. They really like big, deep ponds, and they can tolerate fish, whereas the frogs can't tolerate fish very well. They get eaten. And toads, they've got the toxin on the back of their necks, and so they aren't predated by fish quite so much. So big as much as you can. If you're near any toad areas, particularly big and deep, would be really good. But as you can see that little sketch down the bottom there, that having gentle sides is really, really important. Gently sloping banks are very important, and frogs like to go and lay their spawn in quite shallow areas. So have very, very gentle banks so things can get in and out very easily, and curving or wavy sides are good. Now, if you've got a really wet area, you won't need a liner, and that'll be ideal because we all want to cut down on our plastics. But quite a lot of ponds areas, you still will need some sort of liner. But if you can find a way, if you've got some natural clay and you can just sort of smooth it. We did quite a big pond recently where you had to just a lot of natural clay, just smoothed it all down, got a massive digger, smoothed it all down, and actually it didn't need a liner. So if you found somewhere wet or you've got some natural clay, great. If not, you will need a liner. And if you have a liner, you need an underlay so it doesn't then have, the sharp stones don't get through and you don't get leakage in the future. And that little diagram at the bottom, you can see you have a pond and then the liner goes sort of down, is weighed down a little bit so that it doesn't sort of fall off or anything. It's really secure then. So you have the liner going along the pond, and then it sort of have a little trench, and then you can fill that with some soil and other plants, and then that's really secure in your pond. If you can fill your pond with rainwater, that's best, but if it's big, there's no way you'll be able to do that. So you can use tap water and get the fire brigade or something to fill it all up, and then the chemicals do dissipate over time. So, but certainly if you're topping up a pond, especially a small pond, you're better off with rainwater. So if you've got a building nearby and you're collecting the rainwater, use that as a top up. Now, if you want some help on designing a pond, we've got a wildlife pond visualizer. And so it's an app on your phone, and you can just sort of think, well, I'll have it this size, and let's see what it looks like if I change the shape there and I'll change the structure there. So you can just sort of visualize, because not everyone can sort of think 3D, and it's easier just to have an app that can just help you design it and put different plants in and do different shapes. So that's available on our website if you want to just download that for free on your phone, and you can visualize what your pond's going to look like. Create it, well, just dig it, get in there and dig it, get some strong people, and it's a nice community project. Or if it's going to be a big pond, get a big digger in there and just dig your pond. And just note that one on the left there, you see they've got the shelving, they've got the different layers of the pond, so they're thinking about that from the start. Oh, I didn't mention depth either, that you don't want it to freeze completely in the winter. So in the winter, if you keep it so that it's around about 1 meter or so at its deepest, and then much shallower the rest of it, because it's best if it doesn't freeze completely through in the winter, and because sometimes you get species that hibernate down the bottom of the pond. So make sure it doesn't, to make sure it is deep enough at some point in the pond. And also if it's reasonably deep, you don't have to clear it out too often. It doesn't matter if you get a little bit of debris down the bottom. Right, some plants. You need some lovely plants in your pond. So lots of oxygenating plants, and then it will just sort itself out. So get the plants in there as soon as you've dug it, and then just leave it, and they will then oxygenate your pond, and it'll be just much healthier. So some native species like rigid hornwort or frogbit or common starwort. So some of those lovely native species, put those in the ponds around the edge, and most of them you can just drop them in. And if you want to, we've got a little, I don't know if you can see this, that the little guide called the Just Add Water. which is on our website, the Frog Life website, about a pond, and it's got a big long list of possible plants. But there's on the Freshwater Habitats Trust, they've got lots of, and the Wildlife Trust, they've got lots of lists of suitable plants, so it's not too hard to find suitable plants. But do avoid the non-natives like the floating pennywort or the parrot's feather or these things. They're really invasive and they'll just take over, so you really don't want those. And that's why it's best to get ones that you know what they are and not just swipe them from a nearby pond, because you might well have some of those species in there. So be careful where you get your plants from. Oh, and I have heard that people who have got no money, that if you get some watercress from the supermarket, that apparently that works. I've not tried it myself, but apparently just getting some watercress for a pound from the supermarket and giving it a bit of a wash, and in it goes. And some people have told me it works. I haven't tried it myself, but it might be worth a go because it's quite a bit cheaper. Right. You need to think about what's around your pond, because you sometimes see people who've got a beautiful pond and then they say, but nothing's coming, why is that? And it's because you need the habitats round and about the pond, and that's what the animals need. Because as I say, a lot of the frogs and the toads, they only actually spend a few weeks in the pond, and then after that they're out and about elsewhere, so they really do need lots of good habitats around. So this is, the ones on either side are Kensington Meadows Park, and so I did show you the image of it when it just looks like it's just a green flat area of recreation fields, but there's a lot of wildlife stuff that they've got all the way around the edges. So things like they've just left logs, and so they could rot down. That's great habitats, and there'll be lots of beasties in there for the frogs and the toads to eat and for other animals to eat. And things like just they put a big mound. I think presumably it's for as for wildflowers, but if you've got all your spoil from your pond and you're thinking, well, what am I going to do with it? Well, you can just create a mound, and if it's from the soil quite deep down, it's going to be quite nutrient deficient, and that's best for wildflowers. So you can create a beautiful butterfly bank or a little reptile basking area. So having different features and having mounds in there is a really good idea. And the middle picture is a hibernaculum, and so that's specifically been made for amphibians to spend the winter. So it's just a pile of logs. You need quite a lot of little crevices and spaces, and then some just having some soil and things over the top of it. And again, you can put the spoil from the top, from the pond when you've dug it on your hibernaculum. Long grasses around the edge of the pond and little bushes are really good, and if you've got a compost heap nearby, it's a nice food source. So it can show you just have varied habitats around the pond is really, really important. Okay, a few more tips. Fish, generally not ideal in a wildlife pond, especially the exotic species. They just dominate really and reduce other wildlife, so not great. But as I said earlier on, you can have different ponds for different purposes. So you can have some ponds with fish and so that people can have, enjoy looking at, and you can have other ones that are for wildlife. Fish excretion may mean ponds need more cleaning if you've got a lot of fish. Right, pond pumps. We've just had some concerns about pond pumps, because if you've got a pond which has got a little fountain, some species get sucked up, and we've just been hearing about tadpoles getting sucked up pond pumps, and even if you've got a mesh, that should help. So have a little mesh around the pump. And then that'll stop some of the bigger species, but even the smaller species will go up, and it doesn't do them any good having a pond pump. So we just recommend don't have them. Just put oxygenating plants in. Don't have a pond pump because it doesn't do the species any good. But again, you might have you might want a water feature as one thing, and then your wildlife pond as another thing. So you might want to, in your water feature, have a pond pump. But if you're focusing on wildlife, you wouldn't really want a pond pump. When you put in your pond, think about permissions, and do you need any? Generally, we don't. We put in about 700 ponds in parks in the last couple of years, and we've had very few that have needed permissions. So you don't normally need planning permission. If you've got great crested newt there at the moment, you will need a license to be able to do any work, even if it's improving it for great crested newt. And if it's a historic site, you might need permission because of you might need some licenses if it's a historic site that you're modifying. So do consider if you do need permissions at your site. Try to avoid swapping tadpoles or things from different ponds. We had terrible issues with diseases with amphibians. So the chytrid fungus has wiped out hundreds of different species in other countries, and we really don't want it coming into this country. And if it does, we don't want it moved around. So try and avoid moving things from ponds. So try not to take toad spawn or frog spawn and try not to move them across in ponds, or try not to move plants from ponds to ponds. And once you've got your pond and it's beautiful and you put your plants in, you can just leave it, and it's amazing. It is really amazing. The wildlife just come. It's like, I just don't know where they come. They just come. So, and we see it on Facebook with people saying, oh, nothing's going to happen, and then they say, oh my God, we've got a frog, and we're just getting all these messages at the moment saying, I just put my pond in last summer and now I've got a frog. Where did it come from? So just leave your pond, and then the wildlife turns up, so you don't need to swap things in or move things in at all. So just try not to risk the disease or any invasive species transfer. Make a maintenance plan, so think about what's going to happen to your pond after you've dug it. I used to work in schools in Bath, and an awful lot of them put ponds in, and they were amazing for some years, and then if the key teacher leaves, and sometimes the pond then gets a little bit neglected. So just think about who is going to look after it next. We still have loads of great school ponds, but just think about who's going to have it, who's going to look after it, and how is it going to get maintained. It doesn't need loads. It doesn't need a lot of work, just occasional vegetation or silt removal you need to, and checking for invasive species. So it's not high maintenance, it's not difficult. And then for your pond, how are you going to fund it? How are you going to get the money to do the pond? If you're just going to dig it yourself, it's not too expensive. It is just the cost of a liner, which is maybe £500 or something. Or if you're in a site that doesn't need a liner, that's not too bad, and it's just a question of putting your species in. So it's not all that expensive. But if you're going to do a bigger one, it does cost if you want to get a digger to dig it out in any depth. So in this area, the community infrastructure levy is a really good source of funds, and a lot of people use that, and a lot of those in Kensington Meadows. I do think that some of the wildlife improvements and the trees and things, my understanding is that was where it came from. So it's a good source of funding in Bath and Bristol to use the community infrastructure levy. And then there's awards for all, the lottery source, and so that's up to £10,000, and that's for community groups. So if you've got a lot of community engagement in your ponds, that's a good source of money. If you just want a few hundred, it's worth trying the Wessex Water Fund, because obviously Wessex Water, they like watery things. So that their watermark scheme has pretty high success rate, but it's not loads of money, but it can help if you just want some plants or something. It might be useful. And then what we do at Frog Life is we get funds from the Natural Lottery Heritage Fund, and we get, so maybe 800,000 or that sort of amount, and do a lot of ponds in a certain area. So and it's just time efficient because we get a digger and it can go around from pond to pond in different parks. So we've done a lot of ponds in parks, and we normally work with funds from the Natural Lottery Heritage Fund, and we particularly work in disadvantaged areas and involve a lot of people in the pond creation and then using the pond afterwards. And also at the moment there's the Green Recovery Challenge Fund, and that's a good source, and we got about £250,000 from that for ponds across Yorkshire. So again, we worked with different local authorities and said, where do you want a pond? And the Friends Off group, where would you like ponds? And we just went round and worked with them, and we only got the funding, but we've got the plans with them, and then we're going to get lots of ponds round across Yorkshire. So there's some thoughts on funding. Okay, just to finish off, a few little pictures of ponds in parks. This particular pond was just not visible. It just completely overgrown. So the top on the left, that's the before, just not visible. It just completely overgrown. And so we just cleared it out a bit, reduced a bit of the trees. And so it's now quite a nice large pond and quite a nice peaceful space. This is fairly typical park view, so just lots of grass and a few trees dotted around. And so, well, why not just stick a pond in between? Just there's a bit of space there, so you can see the diggers going in as they start to dig that pond. This is a before and after a volunteer group went in. Again, it's a pond that would it's in an Ealing park, and it just grown over. And so that's after the volunteers had a good day stomping around in their waders. This one is more of a historic pond, and you can see how dark it's got in the top corner. And it's got quite dark and lots of trees overhanging. And so we just cleared it out, removed some of the trees, and it looks a bit bare at first, but as soon as we get the vegetation in and a bit more planting in, it'll be fine and it'll do really well. And a smaller pond, completely, again, bit overgrown, and then you don't completely clear it, leaving about half of it there. And then the third picture is a damselfly that popped in to visit as soon as we'd cleared the pond, and just there they had just nice to see some wildlife actually enjoying your labours. And that one is just showing shapes, that you can have all sorts of weird and wonderful shapes, and that's better than just having a wild one. So before it was just a sort of rough bit of land, and then made a nice pond with a sort of a different shape. And that one is again tree clearance, and just getting a bit over, so just restoring that pond because it's getting a bit overcast with trees. And then finally, just that's actually the first pond that I showed you right at the beginning. And I said it's getting a bit overgrown. And so they got in there and got their waders on and dug it all out. And so we found a nice new as they were digging. And so just had a great time with the local community digging the pond and clearing it. So yeah, the actual creating the pond is sort of very positive and a lovely thing to do. And then you end up with a fantastic pond for wildlife. So I'm going to finish there. If you want to contact me or any ideas about ponds, as I say, I love ponds, and so any thoughts on ponds and how we can make more ponds in Bath and Bristol, do contact me. And thanks so much for listening to my pond enthusiasm. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thanks a lot, Sheila. That was really great. Really interesting. There are a few questions in the chat, so if you've got time, we can just do a few of those, I think.
Yep.
Perhaps if you could stop sharing. Yeah, that's it. Brilliant. Okay, so there was a couple of points, and I know you mentioned dogs, and Becky mentioned that in particular in relation to Ashton Court, I think. Mm-hmm. That there's the issue of dogs getting in is a problem, and I know that is across parks. Any more thoughts on that you could say on that?
On dogs?
Yeah.
As I say, put the pond somewhere where the dogs don't go too much, and have a big fence, I think, to keep them out. And signs as well, because not everyone knows. They just think their dogs are having a lovely time and they're enjoying it. So actually having a sign saying, look, there's a good reason, please don't let your dog go into this pond.
Yeah, I think that's good. I did hear something on the radio the other day about somebody suggesting areas where dogs could go and have a swim, which,
it may be in the sea. It's just not in a little pond, and especially with the chemicals and the having the with all those flea treatments and things, and some of these shampoos that you use on dogs. That in a tiny pond that will make a difference. If you've got a bigger water body, it won't be as bad, but still, it's still not a great idea. So, and I think there's just being people are more aware of it now, that the problems that dogs are causing in ponds.
Yeah. So there was another point from Roger, which probably is about sort of where you can, making sure you get the thing in the right place. He's talking about Badox Wood, where they've got a stream running through, and they also have got a pond, but they've got a problem with water quality because of road runoff. So
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that is a really good point, that if you've got water running into your park and it's coming off the road, it's sort of drained off the road, that is likely to cause problems in your pond, yes, because especially with salt, so, and certainly with amphibians, the salt is just, they really can't tolerate that very well at all. So if you've got a road that's regularly salted, you really wouldn't be wanting to direct that water into your pond, no.
Okay. And then there was a point from Joe Moore, who at Eastwood Farm, which is a space I know well near me, where they've got a lagoon there which is intermittently filled by the river, and a bomb crater, the pond that's less frequently filled by the river when it gets filled in big floods. They've been there a long time. I think actually the crater pond was probably from a bomb in the Second World War.
Oh wow.
But so they really would like someone to come and have a look at them and see whether they need work now in clearing silt, or so. Is that something that somebody in your organisation can do, or is there somebody you can recommend who can come and sort of do recommendations for existing ponds?
We can certainly come and have a look, yes. And quite often it is that situation with existing ponds that it just does need a bit of basic maintenance, especially if it's not happened for quite a few years. But I think follow the advice that we've got so far. Have you got enough oxygenating plants in there? Are the sides suitable? Have you got plants all the way around? Some of that advice first. So make sure you're sort of on top of those things first before doing any sort of major maintenance.
Okay, great. So we're hoping to have talk from Henry Ford about Henrietta Park shortly. Henry, if you're listening, I can't see you to sort of give you permission to speak at the moment, so I think you need to come back in on the link that you had. So if you could do that, then hopefully you'll be able to give us your experience of what happened at Henrietta Park.
Can I just respond to John Golson's question there before we get going?
Yeah.
He's saying, should we avoid handling of frogs? And yes, we should. There's no reason to handle them at all. It's only if they're in danger that you should be picking them up. It doesn't do them any good, any of the amphibians, and a lot of wildlife, it doesn't do them any good. So if you, we avoid it entirely. We don't use, unless it's for a very specific scientific purpose. So there's no reason to pick up frogs or toads or other wildlife, and so unless they're in danger, it's best just to leave them alone.
Okay, and there were a couple of comments about chlorine and whether you need to put chemicals in to get chlorine out, or whether it disappears on its own.
No, you just leave it. You just leave it. Yeah, just leave it and put your oxygenating plants in. So in a few days, it doesn't take that long to dissipate if you've filled it up with if you've had to fill it up with tap water.
Great.
And yeah, I agree with Peter there as well, saying that it's stronger than avoid non-natives. It's illegal to introduce the species listed. So, it's more than just avoid non-native species. Aha, we've got Henry now.
Yeah, I see Henry. But as just one other thing I'd like to mention is, and actually it was Eastwood Farm. We had a pond dipping platform put in at the time. I don't know what your views are on that, but it did seem to be another way of getting funding, because it was obviously something you could sort of put to funders as being a sort of educational resource.
Absolutely.
And so on.
Oh no, we're very keen on putting platforms in so that it's just more accessible and safer for children, so that they're not going to slip on the banks. So really good for schools and just a bit safer, and people can see the pond more easily. So yeah, definitely have a dipping platform. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I know certainly Parks Department in Bath is very much in favour of having ponds in its parks, and working hopefully with you and others to make that happen. So if there's anybody from Bath, and I think you'll find definitely a sort of positive response from the Parks Department there. Bristol, I think probably there are issues around, well, dogs is one, and safety is the other. So, but I think if park groups do want to have ponds, then talk to the Parks Department, and I'm sure there are ways of doing it. Certainly, recently there's been one put in at Dundridge Park near me, down in the woodland near a stream, which and actually, that just comes on to one other question I think somebody asked about the ponds getting sort of stagnant and lots of sort of green weed, sort of pondweed type stuff not looking good. Is that something to worry about?
If you've got a lot of weed, you can remove it from the surface. So if you get a lot building up there, and it's probably because you've got some nutrients coming in.